Hi, welcome everyone to The Long Library, Ep.5, The Justice and Prudence of War. Of course, the show is a project of the Center for Stateless Society, or C4SS. And Roderick and I are very excited to deliver you Ep.5. We've been talking about doing this essay of Roderick's The Justice and Prudence of War for a while, for probably very predictable reasons. And unfortunately still... a very timely and relevant and insightful piece. So let's just launch right into it. The Justice and Prudence of War. Roderick, why do you think war is so just and prudent?
Because I have been converted to Trumpianism, and I am violating rights anywhere I can. I got corrupted by power, even though I don't have any.
Well, obviously all of that was facetious. I hope our listeners can tell that by Ep.5, at least.
Yeah, sure it was.
Can you? I always like to contextualize the article. This one is from 2006. At least that's when it was published on Mises.org. So, can you tell us a bit of a background of the article, of the state of the world, the state of the libertarian movement? You're kind of speaking to both in that piece.
Okay. Just a second. I lost the screen. You can edit out my losing the screen.
No, our listeners like this stuff. I mean, it's,
okay.
Bring a sense of reality to the polished production.
I wanted to close a tab on my thing here that was making a ding sound, but now I can't find the. Is Zencaster? Is it? Oh, hang on.
I didn't hear any ding.
No, let's see. Oh, let me look the. Let's try. Let's see. Where is Zencaster? Is it a tab in my?
Yeah, it should be a tab in your browser. It has like a little.
Here it is.
Blue circle symbol.
I see it. Okay. Anyway.
Okay, you're good?
You can edit that out or not as you like. But anyway, I'm back. Okay, so I actually wrote this in 2003. I wrote it, wrote the original version of it in 2003. And part of it is excerpted from something I wrote back in 2001. But it was published in 2006 in Reason Papers, but they mistakenly published the first draft instead of the final draft. So the Mises Institute, with whom I was on better terms then than I am now, agreed to publish the correct version on their website. So that's why it's there. But this actually went back to sort of the early days of the Iraq War, and so back then it wasn't Israel and Palestine that I had mainly on my mind. It was the U.S. and Iraq. But it has multiple applicability, and then as now the libertarian movement was divided over the proper response mainly to 9/11. It was the main inciting feature of this. And so I just wanted to write about both what I thought were the correct libertarian moral principles governing warfare, and also what some of the the more pragmatic considerations were. And so that's how it came about. I presented this at some APA, some American Philosophical Association thing, not the Molinari Society, that didn't exist then, I don't think, but some outfit. I think it was the American Association for the Philosophic Study of Society. I don't even know if that still exists. So that was an organization that existed just to get libertarians onto the APA program. I don't know if they still do their thing.
How did it go presenting it at the APA? Like what did
I don't
that
remember.
crowd think of 9/11?
That was 2 years ago.
Okay.
So yeah, I have no idea. I'd even forgotten that I'd presented it until I looked in the. I was rereading the piece. And I looked in the footnotes and saw, oh, it was presented there. I don't remember that, but okay.
I'm interested, just as to still kind of preface the discussion of the article. What was give us your kind of a rundown of the history of your views on this topic beforehand, on war and libertarian theories thereof, in the decades before.
Okay, well, when I first became a libertarian, this is going back more than a decade. When I first became a libertarian, I was much more of a right-wing libertarian in many ways, and I was much more hawkish. I generally thought,
When was this? Were you part of the old right in like the 30s and 40s? Is that when you became?
It was a little bit later.
Okay,
but I read I read Atlas Shrugged in, I guess, 1987. So I was around 15. Not 1987, 1979.
Yeah, that seemed late to me. I was about to just say,
I don't know,
no.
numbers. Anyway, I was around 15 years old. I was in high school. I read Atlas Shrugged, and so that got me into. And of course, Rand's views on war, are mix of quite hawkish and quite anti-hawkish stuff. But anyway, so I was a supporter of Reagan, which means in that respect I was worse than Rand, who was not. And I thought rather simple-mindedly that if mainly I was telling you at the time, well, if communism is bad, then fighting communism is good. And so I was,
makes sense to me.
Anyway, so I was much more hawkish. It was around 1987, so that date does become relevant. Around 87, 88, that I shifted. I'd been reading various things about, not necessarily libertarian, but stuff about American foreign policy. And in fact, there was a book by Jonathan Whitney called Endless Enemies that had a big impact on me. But I got it through Laissez-Faire Books, so they were promoting that. Laissez-Faire Books was a thing that existed for our younger readers. It was a thing that existed in the past. It was a
Now it's authoritarian books.
Yeah, it was a book service that existed in, I think it was New York. In fact, I just saw Chris Barr just had on his feed a picture of him with the owner of it at some long ago event. Anyway,
that was like TikTok for your generation.
A little bit.
Yeah.
TikTok was a character in the Oz books. Going back,
we'll have a whole episode on your thoughts on Wizards of Oz.
Actually, that would be quite possible. But anyway,
I know. So you became less interventionist in your views, or
and sort of also I was my and I was also getting sort of more radically libertarian.
Would you say this was like also part of you becoming more left wing? Were you reading more maybe left wing takes on American foreign policy?
So I was becoming more left wing, not as left wing as I am now, but more left wing, and also I was becoming more radically libertarian at the same time. And I officially became an anarchist in 91, 92, and it was partly connected with the Iraq War. By that time, I was firmly against the Iraq War. This was the first Iraq War, Papa Bush. And I remember reading that in Kuwait, when Hussein invaded Kuwait, there was a period when parts of Kuwait were no longer functionally governed by the government of Kuwait, but were not also governed at that point by Hussein's occupation either, and also not by the Americans. I don't remember exactly what date this was, but anyway, I read the story. I've never seen anything about this since. I read the story about how the people in Kuwait were forming their own associations, just bypassing the mostly not currently functioning governmental options, and forming their own governmental or functions to take on the functions of government. And I remember thinking, I wish I could just continue. And I thought, wait a second, I'm not an anarchist. But it was around that time that I shifted over. Though it couldn't have been that abrupt, because I remember when I told both my mother and my ex-girlfriend that I'd become an anarchist, and they both said, "Oh, I thought you already were." Anyway, so by that time I was both, I got both libertarian enough and lefty enough to be on the correct side of those issues.
So did that? So it kind of in the evolution of your views, it kind of came first was the empirical discussions of war, of U.S. foreign policy in particular. Did you later kind of start to sketch out and develop this more abstract theory? Because that's what this piece is kind of about.
I think they were operating at the same time, because I was also, I was also reading and thinking about the abstract issues too. So I think they kind of fed into each other. Light dawned slowly over the hole, as Wittgenstein says. So I'm not sure that one of them was driving the other more, but each one supported the other.
Well, let's get into the article, which I recommend everyone read in addition to listening to the discussion. But you started the piece in an interesting place. You say libertarianism is fundamentally egalitarian. And so tell our listeners, what do you mean by that, and why is it relevant? How does it become relevant for formulating a libertarian theory of war in particular?
Yeah. Okay. So the particular sense of egalitarianism I have in mind is equality and authority, which is basically what Locke has in mind when Locke talks about in his two treatises on government, when he talks about people being equal in the state of nature. What he means by equal primarily is that no one has authority, more authority over anyone else than anyone else has over them. Now, of course, you could have that equality of authority the Rousseau way, by giving everyone complete and total authority over everyone else simultaneously, but that was not Locke's path, thankfully. Anyway, so and I think that's a way of understanding libertarianism. And at the time that I wrote this article, I forget if it was before this or after this, but I had written, I think it was Equality, the Unknown Ideal, maybe, which is also a piece. I think it was the first talk I gave at the Mises Institute. Where I startled the audience by talking about Rothbard as a great egalitarian theorist. I was always causing trouble. That's
why they had to physically remove you.
It took a while. The mills of Mises grind slowly. Anyway, so the reason this is relevant to this issue is most accounts of the ethics of warfare apply different standards to the actions of governments and the actions of private individuals. In fact, if you look at the standard theory of just war that comes out of Aquinas, the first thing is war has to be, in order for war to be just, it has to be waged by a justly constituted authority, which raises questions about revolutionary wars and so forth. But anyway, if you accept the idea that of this basic idea of libertarian equality, that means and that there isn't that distinction. And this distinction applies more than just to warfare. I think it's an idea that runs through libertarianism generally, which is that government, or whatever you want to call it, institutions that perform the various functions that libertarians think are appropriate, that governments usually perform, they don't do it in virtue of having some special right that other people don't have. The right of security, of people provide you with security, is not different in kind from the kind of authority you have as a private security guard or whatever. Which is why that the rules have to apply to both, and they sort of very much don't in contemporary discussion. So, for example, when the American government bombs the wrong people, wrong people even by their own standards, they will they bomb some wedding party in Yemen or Afghanistan or somewhere, and the best that can happen is that they apologize and say, "Oh, whoops, our bad." But if you were engaging in bazooka practice in your backyard and you accidentally blew away a school bus that was passing by in your neighborhood, and you just said, "Whoops, my bad. I apologize. We're very sorry for the loss of life. Thoughts and prayers." Probably most people wouldn't think that was adequate. They'd think that you would need to face some kind of legal repercussions. But people think that when the government does it, it's just like, okay, whatever. So anyway, whatever the principles are, they have to apply equally to organized institutions like government and to individual people. Ultimately, of course, that really means that you can't have government if by government you mean a coercive monopoly, since coercive monopolies are by that very nature denial of that equality. But whatever you want to call it, some sort of defensive association can't have rights different from rights of individuals, which also means that the ethics of warfare have to be, they have to apply to individual self-defense. They have to apply to revolutionary and insurrectionary warfare. They have to apply to, more conventional kinds of warfare. The same principles have to apply all over. Anyway, so that's why the equality thing is relevant.
Now, the example in your piece for the bazooka hitting a school bus is not, you, the reader. It's someone named Uncle Zeke and their backyard bazooka target practice.
That's what everyone calls you.
Is that?
That's what everyone calls you.
That's what everyone calls me. I didn't know if you had an Uncle Zeke of your own, and like as a kid, he had you over and you played bazooka target practice.
I would have used Corey as an example, but at the time I wrote this, I did not know Corey.
Yeah,
you were not yet part of my life. In fact, how old were you in 2003?
I was a solid 8.
Okay, yeah, and you were not really.
I wasn't into libertarianism until like 8.5.
So you were probably into pizza already, though, I assume.
Oh, always a fan of pizza. I mean, even before I was born. So why do you after your discussion here of egalitarianism, you kind of go on and you start to maybe refute some potential ways of cashing that out. And first you argue against pacifism, both in terms of like foreign policy at large of an organization or on an individual level, just interpersonal between two people. So why is pacifism wrong for the pacifists out there and the people inclined to pacifism?
Okay, so the central principle of some version of a non-aggression principle, and it tells you what you should tells you shouldn't start various kinds of conflicts, but it doesn't. The non-aggression principle doesn't say explicitly what kinds of responses are appropriate when someone else has started it.
I think the pacifists are like calling you because they're upset at this argument. I think they're bothered by it.
So you could raise responses, possible libertarian views about the appropriate response to force could range all the way from pure or absolute pacifism. And I say absolute pacifism because there's some versions of pacifism where by pacifism they just mean opposition to conventional governmental warfare, but they're not necessarily against individual self-defense. So I'm talking about sort of the extreme version of no right of self-defense at all. They could range from that all the way to if if someone in this country attacks us, we can just bomb the hell of it and kill all the innocent civilians we like and whatever. And we find the whole range of views from one to the other in the libertarian movement. Unfortunately, more toward the, there aren't that many pacifists, even though I'm not an absolute pacifist. I think, I'd be happier with more absolute pacifists around than with the with the Leonard Peikoff nuke Iran kind at the other extreme. But so in principle, you could say all those, since they're about responsive or retaliatory force, and the non-aggression principle is just about initiatory force, then they're all compatible with the non-aggression principle. And in some sense, strictly speaking, they might be. But some, I think some are fit with it better than others, or more responsive to the spirit than others. Okay, so so at one end, what is an awkward result of pacifism? I mean, this isn't a knockdown argument. It's just something I find plausible. Is since the difference between rights and other kinds of moral claims is supposed to be that rights are legitimately enforceable. If you're a pacifist, then no claims are legitimately enforceable, which means if you're a pacifist, then you have to reject the notion of rights, at least as traditionally understood. And libertarianism without rights seems a little bit odd. Now, of course, if again, I don't think that's a knockdown argument. If a pacifist were to say to me, the non-aggression principle isn't about rights; it's just about personal moral stuff, and no one has the right. No one is morally entitled to aggress against you. But if they do, there's nothing violent you're allowed to do about it. That's not mean there's nothing you're allowed to do about it, because pacifists do have various responses, and I think and strategies which I think are worth taking seriously. I respect pacifism more than a lot of people do. But still, it seems to me there is a strong presumption in favor of keeping rights in your system of libertarianism if you don't have really good reason to dispense with them. And that means that some kind of forcible response to aggression can be legitimate. But of course, from that doesn't follow that just any old response can be legitimate. And so what I go on to say after that is about that.
Yeah, you kind of get to through the argument for pacifism, so therefore some kind of defense is permissible, if not maybe obligatory. Although maybe you don't really get into that, but
yeah, I don't really get into when or whether it's obligatory. That's sort of a broader issue.
But yeah, at least sometimes. Sure. I mean, right? Otherwise, it just feels like kind of like toothless. And anyway, so you get into the various conditions under which defense is permissible and is appropriate, and you have a couple conditions of that. So one is proportionality. So let's discuss that. Can you tell us what is proportionality? How does it tie into this?
Okay, so imagine that. I mean, the example I give in the paper is: imagine that there is a toddler who is about to step on your toe, and without your permission, and for some reason, and I don't really work out why, but for some reason, the only way you can stop them is by blowing them away with, I forget whether it's a bazooka again or something else. But anyway, the only way you can prevent the toddler from stepping on your toe is by using lethal force against the toddler. And someone could say, I don't think too many people would, but someone could say, well, that's not ruled out by the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle just says, you shouldn't start conflict, but you're free to use as much force as needed to end it. But it doesn't seem very plausible in that case. It seems as though killing the toddler, whether the toddler's innocent or not, maybe the toddler's not innocent. Maybe this is a malicious little toddler who wants to stamp on your foot. Whatever, you're not entitled to kill the toddler, even if that's the only way to prevent that. And so that makes it. It seems as though if you did do that, you'd be violating the spirit of the non-aggression principle because you'd be going beyond what's needed to respond to the aggression. It seems like there's something attractive about the idea that, if someone uses force against you, you have the right to balance that force. If someone is invading your space, you have the right to push them out. But when you do more than is needed to respond to the aggression, or when you go so over the top, it seems as though you are, doing something like aggression yourself. You're upping the ante that way. So So I think that that's a reason to accept, and most people accept some version of a proportionality principle. People disagree about how to apply that, obviously, since lots of military actions in the world are ones that their defenders seem to regard as meeting proportionality criteria, where I might be skeptical. But anyway, so that's so some kind of proportionality is required.
So, like, what are the before moving on to the next condition that licenses defensive force, just to pin down proportionality more? Like, what are the various considerations that like you might take into account for deciding, like, what if this toddler is like 5 feet tall, like six, or maybe immune to the bazooka? Like, what kind of considerations do you
Yeah, I mean, no,
matter?
I'm not sure I can come up with a precise list. I mean, this isn't going to be like an algorithm that you could just apply. It's going to require practical wisdom. But
like, surely, like, moral innocence or like is a central one of them.
Moral innocence makes a difference. So if someone is, so I talk about the difference between an innocent threat and a non-innocent threat. So there's someone who's attacking you because they're really just out to attack you, versus someone who's going to attack you innocently. It could be because they don't realize they're attacking anybody, or it could be that they realize they're attacking somebody, but they think that you're someone else. They think you're the person who's been chasing them with a gun or whatever. So it seems as though the amount of so I think that the proportionality isn't just how aggressive is their action, but I think that the morality behind it makes a difference. The intentionality behind it makes a difference. If they're really if they're innocent, I think you still have the right to defend yourself against an innocent attacker, but I think that the standards are higher for what you have to meet to defend yourself against the innocent than against.
And surely, like, the context, and this obviously goes to the intentions, but the broader environment or context, I feel like this this has interesting implications for other discussions of justifiable force. Like, if someone is stealing bread to survive, or for their family to survive, versus, I don't know, them stealing someone else's bread that they need to survive, right? Like, two, have some qualities that are similar, but other things that differentiate these things.
Yeah. So if someone's stealing my bread, both how much I need the bread and how much they need the bread are going to be relevant. So if I really need the bread and they don't, I would be justified in a greater amount of force than if they really need the bread and I don't. If we both really need the bread, then it gets nasty. And if neither of us needs the bread, then this is just a silly transaction in a happy world. But yeah, those factors would be relevant as well as to how much, for what level of force would be appropriate as a response.
So the other requirement you discussed in this piece for defensive force to be appropriate, or maybe in some sense for force to even count as genuinely defensive at all, and this is the privity of defense requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I don't know if this gets as much attention as it should. Proportionality discussed quite often, but so just tell us the privity of defense.
Okay, so suppose I say, well, if you do something to me, I can do something to you, right? So suppose you kill my innocent family, so I respond by killing your innocent family, which is actually a very common form of retaliation out there in the world, both by governments and by individuals, actually. And I can say, well, it's just retaliatory. I'm doing the same thing to you that you did to me. But if I kill your family in retaliation, I might be retaliating against you, but I'm initiating aggression against them. They weren't part of the story until I brought them into it. So I'm not allowed to attack your family, assuming that they were not involved in your attack on me. I can't attack them as a way of attacking you, because although my response to you is not initiating aggression, my response to them would be initiating aggression.
Okay. This is obviously a very important and central part of the argument.
For example, if you take the cases of one important case historically would be take the bombing of Hiroshima, which was not primarily a military target. I mean, there was some military stuff there, but the reason that Hiroshima was targeted was not this is an important military site. The reason it was targeted was this will be a major blow to Japanese morale, and will be more likely to incentivize them to surrender. And all you can talk about, well, they were part of the workforce, they were contributing materially to the Japanese war cause, but still, it's still pretty tenuous, So mostly they were not legitimate targets, and targeting a non-combatant civilian population as a way of retaliating against the Japanese government is, on this view, not going to be legitimate. And Hiroshima wasn't a case of collateral damage, which we'll presumably be talking about shortly.
Yeah.
It wasn't the case where they were aiming at a military target, and they recognized that there were civilians around and thought, that's too bad. We wish they weren't there, but we have to do this, and too bad that they die. It wasn't like that. There were other cases that were like that, but in the case of targeting Hiroshima, they did it precisely because killing the civilians was part of their plan. If civilians hadn't been killed, it would have been a failure of the mission, because it wouldn't have demoralized the Japanese government enough to nudge them toward being readier to accept unconditional surrender. The Hiroshima bombing would be an example of something that would be it would violate privity of defense.
Right. Or like 9/11.
Likewise, yes.
Okay. I didn't know if you supported 9/11. Okay. Just glad that's out of the way.
The numbers? I have no problem with the number, those particular numbers.
Sure, that's fair.
Yeah, no, but yeah, no.
Now 8 and 12, they can really get it. But
it's a good example because to illustrate this idea that these rules apply both toward governmental action and toward sort of private insurrectionary groups. So whatever Al Qaeda's grievances were, and some of them were legitimate against the U.S. government, and you could make a stronger case for the Pentagon attack, at least stronger than for the towers. Although the Pentagon attack is problematic for some other reasons, but the people in the towers were the World Trade Center were not combatants. So some people tried to argue that they were. I remember that Ward Churchill argued that they were a bunch of little Eichmanns, that they were part of the they were all these people working in finance there were part of the whole military / economic industry that was fueling it. But I think that's pretty tenuous. And says a lot of the people in there were not that. I mean, the people, the baristas in the coffee place and so forth. Anyway, so I think that's another case. It was not a legitimate target, even if there were legitimate grievances against the U.S. government. Again, it's kind of aggregation. You think, well, we have a legitimate grievance against the United States, and this, and here's something that's important in the United States, so we take that out. But that's sort of this aggregation or collectivization. You say, well, the people in the U.S. government are the ones you have a grievance against, but these are different people, and so attacking these people in order to attack the U.S. government is a violation of privity of defense.
Yeah, I've even I've encountered that argument and that perspective out in the wild. That the World Trade Center, was filled with a bunch of Eichmanns, and that they were, relevantly involved, such that they could be legitimately targets of lethal action. It's very there's a tendency on I feel like for every government there exists some same with the Hiroshima bombing. Of course, that's defending that is a lot more common and prominent, at least here in the United States, and among people we talk to. Very, very common, and even among libertarians, to make excuses for that, and count the obvious civilian targets as legitimate. And yeah, it's very strange. I mean, I've encountered that argument that the Trade Center was a legitimate target, not even when arguing about politics, but when publicly discussing my grandfather worked in the Trade Center, and he was there in the 1993 bombing and told me about it, and he retired only in 2000. So I knew some people, unfortunately.
It was a good time to retire
later. Yeah, very weird timing, obviously. But all he did was sell insurance. So many people clearly unrelated to any sort of relevant military target. But there exist people that want to make some defense, and I think that comes out of more too of the left, the really left wing or tanky, more appropriately type of terminology. The kind of governments and crimes that those folks tend to support.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know how how many people would consistently take this view, like for both Hiroshima and 9/11, because I suspect that a lot of the people who take that line on one of them wouldn't take it on the other.
Right.
Not that consistency would be better, since they'd be favoring even more bad stuff.
No. Well, one is a defensivist Western government, and the other a revolutionary anti-Western government.
Yeah, and and again, I think that it doesn't, it doesn't make a difference. It's still, and now it's true that there are all kinds of ways in which people are contributing to unjust things. I mean, everyone who pays taxes is contributing. Of course, they're not contributing voluntarily, but people who are contributing to the are offering, in that sense, material support to, if you take that line, then everything that every government does anywhere is something that all the people who are paying taxes in that country are complicit in. Why not just blow up the whole planet? Because the whole population is. I think it's always tempting once you start saying, well, we can take material support into account. I think certain kinds of material support you can legitimately take into account, but if you start pushing it too far, I think you just end up with if you push it too far and you do it consistently, you end up with the absurd conclusion that we should just wipe out most of the human race, which sometimes seems like a good idea, but on balance, I'm not really in favor of it.
It's definitely one of the weaker arguments for wiping out the human race.
Yeah. Most people don't take it consistently. They'll apply it to whichever they'll apply it depending on whether a particular cause is one they're sympathetic to or not. But I think that these are principles that apply regardless of it usually cause is good or bad.
And it usually, in my experience, fits into that dichotomy of either I'm defending and apologizing for the atrocities perpetrated by some Western-style government, or I'm apologizing and excusing the atrocities perpetrated by some anti-Western revolutionary government, or perceived to be revolutionary government. And that applies also to the contemporary issue that most want, made us want to discuss this essay, which is Israel Palestine.
Yeah, and it
So
also
always
reminds me. It reminds me of when I was in grad school. I used to table for Amnesty International, and and have people come by and
really, I
sign.
didn't know that.
Oh, and now my dark past is revealed, and we had letters for people to sign, and there's some people who come and say that they only wanted to sign letters for political prisoners in right-wing regimes, and others who only wanted to sign letters for people in left-wing regimes, and so they is
That's
this
interesting.
political prisoner like in Cuba or someone? Yeah, I'll definitely sign it, but is it in if it's in some right-wing regime, not, and vice versa. I didn't argue with them because I was trying to get them to sign it, but I always wondered,
Yeah.
why does it matter if there's some person who's being imprisoned just for their views, and they're being imprisoned by some authoritarian, crappy government that's locking them up or torturing them and keeping them from their family and so forth? Why does it matter whether whether they're fascist or communist?
Right.
Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, although it's not. I'm sure that if we'd had stuff for Israel and for Palestine, it would have been the same thing. So people would only want to, would find only, only Israeli actions problematic, would find only Palestinian actions problematic.
The fun bit of trivia: Rothbard in the early versions of Ethics of Liberty listed Amnesty International as one of the new budding libertarian organizations in the country at the end of the book, alongside like the Cato Institute and Laissez-Faire Books and all that stuff.
Well, although they're not, explicitly or consistently libertarian, certainly the things that their particular issues, the things they were focused on, were certainly solidly libertarian. Doesn't mean they were committed to libertarian views elsewhere, but they didn't take positions on those other views. They were just not treating people like shit.
Yeah, I thought it was neat to see.
Actually, if that principle applied broadly enough, you get all of libertarianism. But I mean, in this very specific way.
Yeah, I thought it was neat that Rothbard saw hope and potential in a budding organization like that at the time. And
he was a bit,
he never would have changed his views on that, and that's not really part of the discussion. But so this privity of defense requirement for the conditions of legitimate defensive force is interesting to me because it seems to pretty directly follow out of libertarianism, out of like methodological and moral individualism. It seems hard to untether those at all.
It seems right to me. Yeah.
Okay, you agree. Great. I'm glad.
It seems like it's a kind of collectivization to treat the the entire enemy population as just one big glop and say, well, this glop attacked us, so we can attack this glop. I mean, it is like you and your family are walking down the street and you do something to me, so I do something to your family because they're associated with you. Like you're all one agency. And it makes sense if you think that a nation is a collective agency with a collective moral will and collective moral responsibility and so forth. But those are things that don't seem to fit very well with libertarianism. And so it's odd that libertarians will fall for it when it comes to warfare, but they won't fall for it in other cases.
I mean, I was going to say one sect seems to fall for it in warfare, and then usually not overlapping, but maybe sometimes, but usually not overlapping, a different sect falls for it on immigration. And
yes.
Suddenly the entire nation and its will becomes this.
And I think, and coming into the nation without permission is like, coming into your house without permission. It seems amazingly that the anti-immigration libertarians have all suddenly become communists, and they think that the whole territory of the country is the legitimate property of the society as a whole, or the government, or something. which is not the
Yeah.
view that they would usually hold at other times. But suddenly, suddenly they will deviate into collectivism when when it gives them the result they want.
Yeah, it's a weird case of like, I don't know, it seems like a big case of your social environment and circles like shaping the application of your views in some ways, because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise you would just see that that logic applies to both war and immigration, or it doesn't apply
Yeah.
to either of them, not that it applies to one and not the other.
And I think this is sort
uh,
of, I mean, this is, in a way, this is sort of standard throughout history in the sense that, for example, I think that, basic, the basic libertarian principles have been recognized for a long time. If you just say, do you have the right to suddenly attack someone who wasn't attacking you? And historically, most people would say no. So you read someone like Cicero, and he talks about, there's this moral equality, and you don't have the right to, or universal brotherhood, and you don't have the right to impose stuff on other people and so forth. But he never seems to have asked the question, how does this relate to my relationship to my slaves? And it seems so obvious that,
yeah,
if now he had a defensive, he had a kind of defensive slavery, which was, well, if God has placed you in the position of slave, then that shows that that's the part you're supposed to play. You should play it out the best you can. But even if you bought that, and he doesn't seem to have held that consistently, because when Julius Caesar was taking over, Cicero didn't think, oh well, I guess God has cast me in the role of someone who's about to become the subject of a dictator, and so I will be the best subject I can.
yeah,
But anyway, even if that were true, it wouldn't address the standpoint of the person who's doing the enslaving. Saying, all right, so I've got these slaves. What should I do with them? Well, I've got all these principles about equality and brotherhood and peaceful cooperation and all this stuff. It's just so obvious that you apply it here and you get, I shouldn't have slaves. Of course, there's a strong motivation not to think about it, because if you sense that thinking about it would get you into. Although there are plenty of people who did think about it and still didn't do anything. I mean, like a Thomas Jefferson. I mean, he thought his way through it all the way to the right conclusion. I just said, oh well, yeah. So I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. Okay. So you. Oh well. Anyway, that's getting a little bit off track, but.
well, why shouldn't I? Well, no, I think it's relevant, so just pardon the digression, but why shouldn't I just take all that and then just be, why don't I just become a Marxist? And ideas by themselves are pretty impotent, and it's really the material conditions that is shaping everything. Like, why do I care about the ideas? Like you
Well,
just said,
because
that all the time.
not everyone fails to follow the ideas through. It's just the fact that it's a common feature that people don't follow principles to their conclusion if they have strong motivations or strong cultural conditions that go the other way. Doesn't it's not robotic. It doesn't apply to everyone. It's a choice to think carefully about these things or not, and you can be helped or hindered in doing it by various sorts of conditions, and sorting out the effects is complicated. But I think free will and environmental influences coexist, and then neither one is completely sovereign in relationship to the other.
Well, back to the article. Then you move on to apply, fleshing out this libertarian theory of war further, and you discuss basically three potential targets of force: merely innocence, and then force against innocent threats, and then force against innocent shields. So let's just tackle them one at a time, because they all have these separate considerations, and they're
I
all
don't think
deeply
I'm
relevant.
morally allowed to tackle all of them according to my principles.
um, so force against innocence, yay or nay, Roderick Long?
Or I'm generally against it. Well, by innocents, you mean innocents who are not threats or shields. Sort of the
Right, just
otherwise
innocent
cover all three.
simpliciter.
Just non-combatants, you might say. Now, of course, again, there is this issue that being a non-combatant is a matter of degree. We talked earlier about the fact that lots of people are making contributions to the let's say an unjust war effort. Sometimes they're making it involuntarily, but sometimes they're making it voluntarily. Both, but I think proportionality applies there. In fact, someone's paying their taxes, and so $2,000 of their money is going to support the this unjust war effort. I think that the level of response there is limited. Now, I think also this is issues recently. I don't address this in the paper, but recently got into this with Irfan Khawaja, who's a blogger and an old friend of mine, who's very passionately for the Palestinian cause, and we got into a bit of a dispute, which is going on his website, and it's not yet been, probably has not yet reached its completion, about support that isn't material support, but ideological support, like propagandizing. And he's inclined to think that if you are sufficiently involved in propagandizing for an evil regime, then or an evil war effort, then you have the kind of complicity that makes you a legitimate target of force. And and I'm inclined to think it's not the case, that propagandistic support is different from material support, because it's just I think that coming out in favor of something evil is part of freedom of speech. So I don't think you have a right to, a good example.
Sounds like someone who supports evil. Sounds like something they would say, to be honest.
Yeah, a little bit.
We'll include, by the way, the discussion you're referencing on Irfan's post. We'll include a link to that, because it was definitely interesting and relevant and more specific than the article that we're discussing. Specifically about Israel-Palestine and all the details.
But anyway, so you want to move on to the next category.
So what about force against innocent threats? What is that sounds like an oxymoron to some people. So what is an innocent threat? What are some examples? And what about force against?
There are a bunch of different ways someone could be an innocent threat. So you can imagine, this is a bit far-fetched. You can imagine someone who's hypnotized into attacking you, and so it's not their fault. You can come up with more realistic versions. You can have someone who mistakenly thinks you're a threat, but they they might justifiably, under the circumstances, mistakenly think you're a threat, and so they are, they're attacking you. And they're actually aggressing, but they have, as far as they know, they're not, because, you look just like the guy who's been stalking them or whatever. Or there are cases where they don't even realize there's someone there, and they're just like, for some reason you can't make your presence known to them or something. Anyway, any case in which they're threatening you, but they don't realize that they're not responsible for it, and this is part of a broader view I hold, which is that that it's not someone's evil intentions that makes them a legitimate object of a violent response. It's what they're actually doing, and so therefore I think we have the right to defend ourselves against innocent threats, not just against guilty ones. But there is a qualification, which is proportionality can become relevant. I think that the bar you need to meet in order to use, or the amount of violence that's justified in response to an innocent threat, or the bar you have to meet in order to to justify using it, that's going to be different than for a guilty one. So if the amount of care I need to take in order to try to respond to you in a non-lethal way would be greater if you're attacking me innocently than if you're attacking me non-innocently. So it does make a difference. But still, I think that they're still stepping into your space. They're still intruding themselves into your autonomy, and it's they're doing that, not they're doing that plus having guilty thoughts, because we don't have legitimate jurisdiction over people's guilty thoughts. So if you're attacking me innocently and then you're attacking me guiltily, well, the difference is in one case you've got bad thoughts, but I don't have a right to, take action against your bad thoughts. So we have a right against to defend ourselves against.
It seems like threats. Innocent threats. I mean, this is it comes up more often maybe than we think in real life. I mean, it's not just
the whole issue of abortion
it's
relevant too.
Yeah, I was going to get to that as well. Yeah, even though we're not discussing that fully here, but I mean, it comes up just with. I mean, sleepwalking. You can imagine with that. More concretely, various drugs and alcohol can impair people such that they will be engaged in something aggressive, but that they don't have the means to understand your communication or what they're doing or things like that. So other things that impair our rationality. And then obviously, like you said,
kinds of extreme mental illness of certain kinds. I don't have a worked out theory about mental illness. But anyway, it seems like there are some kinds that might cause someone to aggress against you, and you might think it's not their fault. They're
sure
they're off their meds.
Issues of delusion or mania or other things that impair your rationality. Absolutely. And this maybe could even tie then to children in like this ongoingly impaired state is one way you can think of that. And then, like you said, abortion, where this other potential person is occupying your boundaries, perhaps against your will, and obviously they, granting a fetus as a person, they still have no intention or intentional action involved to violate your sphere.
Yeah, and I've got a couple of articles. I've got an article on an old article on abortion. I've also got an article about the role of the irrelevance of responsibility. So maybe we could throw those in the.
Yeah, we'll definitely include anything we mentioned, and these are going to be, probably discussed in later episodes of the show. But what about then its applicability to war in particular, forcing against innocent threats?
Well, I guess in some cases it's going to be a sort of a tricky question whether the degree of innocence. But suppose you've got conscripted soldiers attacking you, and you could say, well, they're not completely innocent because they could just refuse.
Right.
But certainly, I think that their culpability is reduced if they're forced to attack you than if they just signed up eagerly to attack you. So there's a reduced culpability there anyway. Also, there could be people. There could be ones who've been, or there could be people who signed up eagerly, but they have non-culpably or not too culpably bought into a false story about you, so that they think you're the aggressor, they think you're this awful person who's threatening them, and so they, in the end, under the circumstances, maybe it's a country where there isn't much access to alternative sources of information, so all they get is like the official government story, and so they think that you're a threat, and they might be non-culpably thinking that, but you still have the right to defend yourself against them, although you might be sadder about doing it than.
That's an interesting one, because I wonder the extent of the applicability of that one in various cases, especially something like, I guess just to take it to this case, to what extent were the Nazis sincere believers versus was their story of Jewish world domination just a a complete means to an end. I mean, like, to what,
Yeah. Well,
So, like, are
I would
they?
guess that some were sincere and some weren't, or some were more than others. But
Oh, sure, sure.
the ones who were, I'd say, I don't think that, apart from maybe some unusual cases, I don't think that they really count as non-culpable, because they had even if you think that someone who grew up in a complete Nazi regime, that wasn't their case. They'd grown up in the Weimar Republic, and
Right.
the Weimar Republic wasn't perfect, but as as political situations go, it was it was it was pretty open, pretty free. There was lots of information, lots of free discussion, and people had lots of opportunity to interact with Jews and homosexuals and Roma and all the
Sure.
people who were and communists, all the people that they and to see that they're just a bunch of different people with different various different just a bunch of individuals.
So some false beliefs guiding action, I mean, are like so wildly unreasonable or inexcusable for the environment that they formed under. Obviously, yes, that is wildly different than those examples that you gave of like someone living under some authoritarian regime.
Yeah.
And, like,
So, like, if you're
being
going up
drafted into that
in North
war.
Korea, I don't really know. I'm not sure how much in general we know about what it's like to grow up in North Korea, but certainly your access to information other than what the North Korean government wants you to have is very limited. Now, you could still say, well, you ought to exercise due diligence about everything, and sure, in some sense that's true. You ought to, but so it's not that there's it's complete non-culpability, but it's certainly very much reduced.
Right. There's
had no
degrees
real
and
opportunity to
gradients
think about
of
this stuff.
culpability. Yeah, there's degrees and gradients of culpability, and that's relevant, especially because proportionality plays such a role, it seems like, in determining legitimate defense, and that is a central consideration. So then finally, the third category of innocence, which is an innocent shield. So force against innocent shields. This is particularly relevant. What about this?
Yeah. So because this is a case where it's often thought that if you license violence against an innocent shield, you are thereby licensing sort of all the collateral damage that advocates of whichever side want to license. Now, I think that that violence against innocent shields can be justified. So in that sense, I'm not against all possible collateral damage, but I think it's very limited in that once you move from a very specialized case to more realistic cases, it becomes harder and harder to justify. So the example I give is, suppose that you strap a baby to your chest and then you come shooting at me. Do you have the right?
With a bazooka?
I don't know, whatever you got.
Okay, it's a bazooka.
Well, then I'll have to get out my bazooka. It's just dueling bazookas. It's like dueling banjos, only less tuneful. Anyways, you've got the baby strapped to your chest, and you are shooting at me. Is it legitimate for me to shoot you back? And I'm inclined to think yes. So I can understand someone saying no. I can understand someone saying no. There's an innocent baby there, and it's not appropriate. The baby's not threatening you, but baby isn't even innocently threatening you. But I'm inclined to think yes, it is legitimate for me to shoot you back, even if I have to go through the baby, and that ultimately the responsibility lies with you more than me. Although again, I also think that you'd have more obligation to take due care if there's an innocent shield. So again, the proportionality thing. The question is, how far does that scale? Because defenders of sort of massive civilian casualties will often say, well, a lot of the only way we can get to the bad guys is so for example, take Israel and Palestine. The Israeli government says there are these bad people hiding in the hospitals, and so we have to, or at least we think they're probably in the hospitals, and so the only way we can get the the people who are who are running the show is to blow up hospitals full of sick people and full of doctors and nurses who are taking care of the sick people and so forth. I think that as you expand from the one case, so first of all, there's several factors in relevance. So one says, suppose that instead of one baby, you've just got like thousands and thousands of babies somehow strapped to your giant chest or whatever. I think that the more babies that are strapped to your chest, the more the higher the bar gets for violent response. Also, also relevant is how sure I am that you are behind the babies. Suppose I just see a bunch of babies and I have good reason to think that Corey's hiding behind them. But, the less certain that I am that you really are behind there, the weaker my case gets for blasting at the babies. Also, how likely is it that my response is actually going to get you? Maybe you're behind there, but, I'm shooting at this massive wall of babies and you're somewhere behind there, but, the more that my, the lower the chances I'm getting you, the weaker my case becomes. Also, how much of a contribution is my response going to make to eliminating the overall threat? Because assume that it's not just you, but you're part of a vast force attacking me, and if just taking out you along with all these babies isn't going to make that much difference, then it also weakens it. So once you bring in all those considerations, I think that the case for killing the babies goes down and down and down. So there'll be cases where it's going to be justified, but I think it becomes harder and harder to justify. You can't just jump from, I can kill the one guy who's got the baby on his chest to I can demolish an entire city because I suspect that some leaders of the opposition are lurking in there somewhere.
Now, I think this is interesting.
So this is relevant to Israeli policy, although I think it's also relevant to Palestinian policy going the other way in some cases.
Yeah, and now it's interesting. I think on this particular part of the piece. Now, for those who haven't read the piece yet, structurally, it's the justice and prudence of war. So it's divided between considerations of justice or deontological considerations, and then considerations of prudence or consequentialist considerations. And this is part of the first half where it's deontological considerations. But as you obviously note, these are intertwined and inseparable on some level. And it's just that force against innocent shields seems to be the one that where it most has to import these auxiliary consequential considerations to really figure out the what kind of force is appropriate, if any. And like you said, the particular issue of like scaling up and then seeing how this case of forcing against innocent shields actually plays out in cases of contemporary warfare versus these imagined hypotheticals of one person with one baby and like one direct threat. And it's like this very simplified thing that doesn't translate or apply to issues of contemporary warfare.
Yeah, of course, a lot of people will say these restrictions would make it impossible for us to defend ourselves. In fact, I've seen both defenders of the Israeli cause and defenders of the Palestinian cause say, how can we meaningfully defend ourselves if we have to shackle ourselves that way? How can we? So defenders of the Israeli side saying, how can we effectively fight against Hamas if the Hamas leaders are hiding inside hospitals unless we blast the hospital? But you also see people on the Palestinian side saying, look, it'd be nice if we could, if we could directly target like Netanyahu or someone, but that's really hard. We just blast away to the extent that we can, and Palestinians, their military options are are weaker. They have fewer resources, but they still will, kill, people as far as they can on the other side. And it's sort of a mix of innocent people and in non-threats and innocent shields and so forth, all over on their side. And then again, also this came up too, is given that almost everyone in Israel is subject to military conscription, you could say, well, that makes the whole civilian population a threat, because either they are in the army, or they're going to be, or they're likely to be conscripted into the army. But again, I think that's too much aggregation. But again, it's going to, but I can understand the frustration on each side of someone saying, how can I defend myself? How can we defend ourselves against the other side if we're limited in this way? But, morality's a bitch sometimes.
Okay.
Well, I also have to say about when we get to the Prudence side, I'll have stuff to say about that. But
well, it seems like a prudent time to get to the Prudence side. I mean, that's basically the end of the first section, and then before we move on to the Prudence side, that might be a little imprudent. It's worth pointing out. It seems like you could generate a lot of agreement based on the abstract arguments of the first part of the piece that we've discussed thus far. And so much of the disagreement really comes down to the empirical and applicable part, where it's like, okay, who counts as what? Who counts as a threat? Who counts as what kind of threat? What counts as support for that threat, material, ideological, otherwise? And you really get into the weeds of these this difficulty in applying these moral categories.
Which side is the initiator of the war? Because although I think that there are moral responses on what you can do in response to the initiation, still issues of proportionality mean that it's going to make a difference who initiated it. But there are often lots of disputes about who initiated it. Now, obviously, in the Israel-Palestine case, are we talking about whatever happened? Which side broke the last ceasefire, or are we going all the way back to the 1940s,
right,
or back to the to the 1960s, or are we going all the way back to 3,000 years ago, and so forth, and all these different stories about which one counts as the aggressor. And partly these are disputes about moral issues, and partly they're disputes about
historical issues.
What the historical facts were, or any sort of a mix, like how far does this particular historical fact morally count? So it's it's very
how much is a property claim that's thousands of years old? How much does that count?
Yeah, and all the questions well, if you bought property, but you could say, well, I didn't take this property from anyone. I bought it, but I didn't buy it from the owners. I bought it from the Turkish occupiers, and so my right to it is the same as Lord Elgin's right to the Parthenon marbles, essentially. Some occupying force came in and just claimed all this stuff and then sold some of it to me. Anyway, that complicates it, but I still think that there are, even apart from the question of which side is ultimately the initiator, given privity of defense, there are limits on what you can do against the less violent people on the other side. If you're blowing up children or whatever on either side, to that extent, it matters a lot less to that extent which side was the initiator, because those kids, whether they're Palestinian kids or Israeli kids, are not initiating anything. And you could say, well, they're going to grow up, and each side finds this plausible about the other side. A lot of defenders of Israel will say, well, the whole Palestinian population, even the kids, they're going to grow up, they're going to become terrorists. We take them out now. Just kill them all. And there's similar attitudes sometimes on the Palestinian side about Israelis. So if you push, complicity or potential threats, you push it far enough, eventually you get to the point that, if you really bought that argument, I think it would apply to both sides. And so you have to say, well, it's true that there's, if we say there's a good chance that most Palestinians are going to grow up to be commit terrorist acts against innocent Israelis. There's a good chance that most Israelis are going to go up to commit terrorist acts against innocent Palestinians. If you buy both of those arguments, and I think that if you buy one, you don't really have a good reason not to buy the other, regardless of which side you think started it. Then the argument would just wipe out all the Israelis and all the Palestinians. But no one's really in favor of that view. Well, there's probably some assholes in favor of that view.
Yeah.
But certainly there are people who favor that view by mistake. There are all the people, I've seen certain people calling for nuking Gaza, literally nuking Gaza. What do you think it would do to Israel to nuke Gaza? Have they ever heard of fallout? Yeah. I don't think Israel would be happy with anyone dropping nuclear bombs on Gaza, unless they were like really, really strategically narrow in their effects.
One of the things that we just briefly touched on just now could potentially be a fit maybe for the category of innocent threat, if we're thinking of other instances of innocent threat, which is, I suppose, the inheritor of an unjust property claim, who hasn't done anything maybe directly, but is still, in a sense, occupying the rightful sphere of authority of another party who was stolen from.
Yeah,
and so that seems to apply a lot in this case and in these related cases.
Yeah, it's definitely relevant. And I know that some libertarians, like Jan Narveson, has the view that, and he completely rejects the whole, basically rejects that whole branch of rectificatory justice, because he says, look, if I steal something from you and then I give it to someone else, or I sell it to someone else, or they inherit it from me or whatever, it would be punishing them if they innocently received it. And you can't punish people for innocent. But most libertarians are more open to this sort of rectificatory idea that if someone stole something and gave it to someone else, that the person owes it back. Of course, then there are questions historically, and this applies to Israel and Palestine, but also applies to like Native American land claims, and applies to rectifying things that resulted from communism, and the different post-communist states have gone about these things differently. And then some people worry, well, how far back do you push this? A lot of defenders of Israel who want to push land claims there back 3,000 years don't necessarily want to push land claims in the United States back 3,000 years. And questions about, do you have to identify a particular chain of inheritance, or is it in terms of individuals, or can you just identify a group? And I've got views about various aspects of that, but I certainly don't have a worked out theory about how far rectification can go, or how far it applies.
Yeah, and it seems like excessively centering moral responsibility or lack thereof in your story of like justice and like how do we apply it. Like it seems like that is going to be so like useless, if maybe worse, like in a world where the history of property titles is so bloodstained and connected to various thefts and occupations and unjust actions. Like if we just enter this world where like the history of property titles is like so tainted with blood and injustice, and then we just say like the actual fact of like who's occupying whose sphere of like legitimate property titles. Like if you just try to settle that with appealing to like the moral responsibility of the people who are now living and involved, then it doesn't seem like a very good place to start. There's no way to really account for the history of the property titles.
Yeah, you've got, so at the one extreme, you can have the view of saying that we have to go as far back as we can. The Normans took the land in England from the Saxons, but the Saxons took it from the Celts, and the Celts may have taken it from some previous people. And, there's a limit to how far you can go back. Although it's also, the farther you go back, the murkier it becomes as to what actually happened. I mean, like, if we're going back in Israel 3,000 years ago, we're going about stuff that's reported in the Bible. Well, how far is the Bible historically accurate? Is that how far is that a reliable source? And then who are the who counts the legitimate inheritors of. Says, of course, according to the Bible, the Jews, violently seized that area from the Canaanites. Now, actually, a lot of historians think they didn't. They think that it was actually peaceful, or mostly peaceful. But the Jews' own story about it in the Bible was that they took it by violence, which would, which would mean that we should trace back. Who are the descendants of the Canaanites? I have no idea.
Yeah.
But the other extreme is to say, no, we'll just treat all property titles starting from now as legitimate.
Yeah.
And so, if I'm the king's crony and I own 90% of the land, we'll just treat that as legitimate going forward. And that doesn't work either. But that's why it's important that I think deontological considerations and consequential considerations interact. This is part of my sort of Aristotelian ethical view that the virtues inform each other, their contents inform each other, and so more consequence sensitive virtues like benevolence, and more deontologically sensitive virtues like justice inform each other and sort of specify each other. And so you could work out what view you should have if you're purely deontological and took no consequential considerations into account, or you could do the other. And both, I think, would be likely to result in suboptimal views. But instead, they have to mutually inform each other. Now, I don't think there's any precise rules. There probably are. There's probably some rules about the details of it, but I don't think there's any rule that's going to fully settle. It's going to be a matter of practical wisdom.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that, just because it's not like a central theme of the piece, but obviously it's a central theme of your work. We discussed it at length in episode 3 on eudaimonism and non-aggression. If anyone wants to go back and listen to that one, but yeah, the unity of virtue and like the way this piece is like couched in like the justice and prudence of war, like these two virtue considerations, and trying to
Now, of course, the way I put it, justice and prudence, I make it sound a bit as though they're like. There's these two separate classes of consideration, because there's a limit to how much I could get into in this piece. But and of course I argue that what I have to say about the two, they broadly go together. But as you pointed out, I'm already bringing consequential considerations in to the ontological side, and I likewise I would do it the other way as well, because I think that what consequences play a role in what's going to be just. On the other hand, considerations about justice going to play a role in what counts as a good consequence.
And if anything, the first half of the piece is really a testament to more broadly to the way deontic considerations, and for libertarians considerations merely of justice and non-aggression in particular, can't stand alone. They can't apply themselves, and they're going to require to even specify them conceptually and understand what they require in the abstract. It will involve auxiliary empirical assumptions, questions of history and matter of fact, like we said, and epistemology, considerations of like social construction and like what counts as communicating that I'm not consenting to this, or that I'm actually giving this to you as part of a trade. Like what counts as these things in your culture and like in your language and stuff like that. So,
and broadly speaking, property rights, for example. Again, this is a bit of a digression, but there's some who think that property rights can be entirely derived simply from a some fairly mechanical application of non-aggression, and the others who think property rights are purely conventional. And once again, I'm somewhere in between. I think that you can on a deontic grounds justify property rights, but they're precise contours. Like, is it a violation of your property rights if someone crosses your lawn on the way somewhere? Local expectations can make a difference to that. If you live in a society, like, suppose I'm driving along and I turn around and you're driving along and you realize that you've going the wrong way, and so you turn around in someone's driveway. Well, technically, you've gone onto their property without their permission, and you're not there to interact with them at all. And most people wouldn't think that was a big deal. But there might be societies where that would be forbidden. There might be societies where more than that would be allowed. And I think, the boundaries are fuzzy. And the boundaries are fuzzy doesn't mean that everything's fuzzy all the way in. But
Yeah,
most conceptual boundaries are fuzzy. The boundary
they're fuzzy,
between
they're porous.
red and orange. And you can say you're allowed to have red things here, but not orange things. Well, it's going to be fuzzy, and we just deal with it.
Yeah, I find a lot of use in Rothbard's distinction between like a physicalistic conception of aggression or a praxeological conception of aggression, and like, are we like tracking the like individual molecules and where they go, or is what's more relevant and morally behind the idea of libertarianism,
David
the idea
Friedman
of
has
like
all
the
those.
actions taken?
Because David Friedman has those arguments about, saying, am I
Yeah,
violating aggression if I shine a flashlight onto your property?
yeah,
And, some photons are streaming onto your property, and it seems,
right,
reasonable to say not. On the other hand, if it's a powerful laser that's actually blasting apart
right.
your property, it seems yes. But,
But if
there's,
but if the photons are not actually interfering with your projects undertaken by your actions,
Mhm.
the praxeological part,
Yeah.
like, then why does
Yeah.
that
There's also
matter
there's
for the
sort of
theory?
just a general background, like, if I'm in your vicinity,
Yeah,
then, you're breathing my air, I'm breathing your air. But that's just part of the natural background of our being able to interact at all. And so if I were to say, I
that's
don't want
sure.
any molecules from you coming on over in my, I might even say, I've got a project of being free from your molecules. And so if any molecules come from you, they're interfering with my project. Well, that just violates some of the basic background conditions of our being able to interact, and so that would be an unreasonable interpretation of aggression.
Well, let's get back to the article and wrap up with the piece by discussing the second half, the more specifically consequentialist considerations by themselves. And you make an interesting parallel between Mises's arguments on like economic interventionism and the issue of foreign policy. And so I thought this was a fun and illuminating parallel. So can you expand on that for fellow
Yeah.
listeners?
So Mises has this argument that the government interventions tend to spawn more government interventions because he thinks the government intervenes. Let's say the government uh, uh, you know let's say the government has a minimum wage law, and in order to to help, at least suppose that's their motivation. It could really be to help lower income people get more money. But then you end up with people being people who are not sufficiently valuable to the employer at that age, being fired or not hired, and so you think, all right, well now I've got a new problem. So you come up with a new thing. Okay, so we need a welfare program for these people, but then then there are various problems with the welfare program, creates this incentive or that or whatever. And so every time that you intervene, it creates some new problem. And then if you have an interventionist mindset, you'll say, well, we need a new intervention and we need a new one. And so you keep adding more and more. And then the cumulative effect of these interventions is really bad for the economy. So likewise, in foreign policy, particularly when it comes to retaliation, um, um, uh, you say, well, you intervene. The United States intervenes somewhere in the Middle East or Central America, one of these places where they or Southeast Asia, one of these places where they like to intervene. We'll take the Middle East since that's sort of especially relevant. You intervene in the Middle East in various ways. You bomb civilians in various places, and you get some annoyed people as a result who then might commit terrorist acts against you, and the terrorist acts, might not be justified in the way they're carried out, but there's an explanation for them, and so you think we have to respond to that. I also take 9/11. A lot of Americans treated 9/11 as though we're just out of the blue. Like one day, a bunch of angry Muslims decided that they hated our freedom, and so they wanted to blow up our buildings. And the fact that this was largely a response to various kinds of military interventions by the U.S. was sort of ignored. But of course, those interventions bred this response. And so, of course, then the United States says we have to retaliate again. We have to, well, they didn't say again. We have to retaliate for this act. And so they go and they bomb more people, and this creates more of a response. And then if you point this out to people, they'll often say, as a lot of people did say after 9/11, a lot of people did say, well, maybe it's true that 9/11 was motivated by by things that the U.S. did in the Middle East, and maybe the things that the U.S. did in the Middle East were really bad. But it's too late now to go back because they're already angry over there, and they're not going to be unangry if we just stop now. And so we have to completely crush them. But of course, people were making that argument before 9/11 as well, and it can go back and back and back. It's kind of like, Jefferson's argument for slavery was, well, what we're doing is unjust, but it's too dangerous. He says it's like holding a wolf by the ears. We shouldn't have grabbed the wolf by the ears. But now we can let it go, because if we free the slaves now, then they'll all rise up and kill us. Which, incidentally, when the slaves were freed, was not what happened. But there's always some justification for saying, even if what they're doing is, even if like 9/11 is blowback for bad stuff we did, we shouldn't have done the bad stuff. It's too late now. And so that's always an argument for intervening more and more. And of course, you just create more and more of the blowback. So there's a risk in not retaliating, but that doesn't mean that there isn't also a risk in retaliating. And creating, still more of the blowback. And likewise, with Israel and Palestine too. So, for example, there are some people who say, well, maybe what Israel did, back in the 1940s when they were first founded, maybe there were some problems in. Not everyone says this, but a lot of people say maybe some of the ways in which that land was acquired from Palestinians and Palestinians were kicked out was illegitimate, and maybe some of the things that the Israelis did to the Palestinians count as terrorism and so forth. It shouldn't have happened. But it's too late now. The Palestinians are this whole massive group of people who are all just filled with hatred of Jews now. And maybe they weren't back then, but they are now, and it's too late. And so we just have to crush them all. And so they do all these things to Palestinians. Of course, the Palestinians will do things back. They do unjust things to the Palestinians. The Palestinians will do unjust things back, like the October 7th thing. And of course, just like as with 9/11, each thing that happens is treated as like it's the first thing. Like when Hamas attacked on October 7th, a lot of people treated it as like that was the beginning. Nothing had happened before that. There was just like a lot of Americans treated 9/11 as out of the blue. These people come and they blow up these skyscrapers. When in fact, both of those were responses. They were morally illegitimate responses, but they're responses that were for which the victim country bore causal responsibility, not sole causal responsibility, but yeah.
Right. In the section on consequentialist considerations, you also discuss some of the more familiar libertarian arguments, of course, the information and incentive problems facing governments. Maybe you don't need to recapitulate those entirely for our audience, but specifically maybe in the context of war, it does seem like people often, and I guess maybe that's how you operated when you were initially a libertarian, but also had these interventionist views. The idea that those constraints don't really operate or matter as much in the context of foreign policy, but it seems like they matter even more.
Yeah.
With those much at stake.
So there are, there are familiar problems both incentival and informational about governments for libertarians. This is a reason either to greatly restrain government if you're a minarchist, or to abolish it if you're an anarchist. So the informational constraints are, as a monopoly, it's really hard. When if you're a monopoly, you're subject to certain kinds of informational constraints, because you're the only one operating. Actually, a good example is Robert Higgs talks about the sort of essentially the military takeover of the U.S. economy during World War II, and he says that the illusion that World War II was good for the domestic economy is based on the fact that the government effectively was like setting prices, and the prices were like dummy prices. The market was being disabled, and so the prices didn't reflect. The extent to which they reflected actual conditions was very much weakened, and so you can't really draw much of in the way of inferences. So he says that, it talks about that in, I forget which book it is, but it's one that has a tank on the cover, I think. But it's just in general, a monopoly, a hierarchical monopoly is restricted because there's absence of competition, restricted what kind of information it can have. Also, the hierarchical nature of it. This is sort of moving from Hayek territory to Robert Anton Wilson and Kevin Carson territory. But the problem is that information doesn't travel well up hierarchies. People are afraid to tell the whole truth to their superiors. Actually, this worked out well in the case of Hitler, because Hitler got so angry when people told him that the war effort wasn't going well that they stopped telling him. So he was making military decisions based on mistaken information as to what was going on, because people were afraid of his wrath if they told him the truth. And so that makes it difficult for them to know what they're doing. So even if
I doubt that has any parallels to what's going on in our country right now.
Oh no, none whatsoever. Well, if there's with our case, you've got someone in charge who doesn't seem. It's not that he's. I don't know. I think Hitler cared about getting the right information. He was just his dictatorial wrath made it hard for him to get it. I'm not sure Trump even has a concept of objective reality. I don't know what to make of him, but reality is just whatever he constructs for his own purposes. I mean, recently he announced on Twitter that by sending forces into Los Angeles to stop the anti-ICE riots, he prevented the city of Los Angeles from being totally obliterated.
Obliterated, yeah. That would have been terrible.
A bold claim. I mean, even if you thought that the anti-ICE protesters were bad, that would have been a mighty task for them to pull off, to obliterate. I mean, the city of Los Angeles. I mean, I was born in LA. It was pretty big even then. It's a lot bigger now. It would be hard to obliterate the whole place. Anyway, so there are those informational problems. Also, of course, there are instantival problems. To the extent that something is a monopoly, it is. It's freed from certain kinds of constraints. Now, of course, a government that's organized with a balance of powers and checks and balances is better than one that isn't. Of course, the idea of checks and balances is also something that is foreign to our current president. But certainly that's better than one where like all decision making is centered in one. But even if you've got checks and balances within a monopoly, that's certainly better than not having them. But still, it is, as long as it's a monopoly, then it is, there are forms of feedback it's just not getting. And so that's an informational problem, but also means it's easier to abuse power to the extent you're not being checked and balanced. So if there are no checks and balances within the governmental system, then abuse of power becomes very easy and very tempting. If there is, then it's harder, but obviously still happens. And because as long as the government is a monopoly, it's not checked and balanced by people, forces outside it. So, for example, and this is sort of explicitly bringing in anarchy. But suppose that you could cancel your subscription to the U.S. government and sign up with some other organization, just like you could cancel your phone service or Netflix or whatever and switch to something else. And so you just would, your money would stop going to the U.S. government. A lot of people would be canceling their service to the U.S. government right now, and that would serve as a check on abuse of power. And even if they weren't doing it, the fact that they could do it would anyway. So those are some general issues.
I love the idea of Trump tweeting about like too many people are canceling their services with the American government. Like that just like I know that's not our reality; it's some bizarre reality. But I guess maybe that's the ultimate like ANCAP reality, at least for the quotes. Trump is president, but you can also like opt out somehow if you really wanted.
Where is the opt-out button?
Let's.
So in warfare, governments are particularly so informational problems. Governments can make mistakes, and how often do? I mean, one of the things that I got from reading that Jonathan Whitney book, Endless Enemies. I got the hardback edition, which didn't have the sections on the CIA redacted, because there were communiques from CIA agents about the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran that he included, and the CIA managed to get those redacted in the paperback version. The paperback version just has big blank spaces there. But I got the hardback version from Let's See for Books and still had that. But anyway, one of the things that he points out is many of the cases where the U.S. Government was making just bad decisions about who were likely to be the who even if you assume that the U.S.'s world power ambitions were legitimate, it was just making bad decisions about who were the best allies and who were the most likely enemies and so forth, and no one was giving any feedback, and that certainly applies to Trump. Trump is certainly one of these cases of someone who no one seems to be. And one of the differences I think between his second administration and his first is during his first administration, he was surrounded by advisors who were not quite as deranged as he was and were not quite as submissive to him. And so I think he was checked somewhat by them. Plus also, I think the pandemic distracted him, or took the wind out of his sails to some extent. But now he's surrounded just by complete toadies and yes men, and also the threats against people who are not on board have just massively escalated. But of course, the result of that is that everyone's afraid to tell him anything. So if you're conducting a war and people are afraid to tell you stuff, you're not going to get the right information. And also, if you are a monopoly, you're also going to be you're going to have impunity to make. Not only are you likely to make poor decisions informationally, but also you're going to have the impunity to make morally evil decisions because it's easier to get away with them.
Yeah,
and so that's why we shouldn't hold government to a lighter standard than we do private individuals or private organizations, because government's especially dangerous.
Now, I have two thoughts. One is that in addition to everything you said, part of that informational problem with information traveling up hierarchies, too, of course, isn't just unwillingness out of fear of the wrath of your superior, but like the very nature of the information that's trying to be communicated, of course, is going, what even if you were completely unafraid of your superior, I mean, the kind of information you're able to communicate from the person who's actually in that situation, in that context, has up close knowledge of it, all the way up to someone who's thousands of miles away. It's not, it's not going to be the same exact kind of information by the time it gets to the top of the chain. The other note I had was just, I think somewhere in there you said checks and balances are foreign to Trump, but you should be careful with that. He might slap a tariff on them if you say that too loudly. Thanks. I'll be here all day. So just
During
to
the 19th century, our monetary system was entirely tariff based. Said Trump.
So moving on here, I think unfortunately one way in which a lot of people who are maybe initially skeptical and opposed to war and government bombings and and a lot of foreign policy, they wind up adopting these interventionist arguments. But then a lot of times these interventionist arguments get shaped or distorted in a certain way as to be applied in this very like specifically nationalist way. And you don't really touch on this in the piece that much, but they get, I feel like, distorted in this way. And so then it can quickly become more about shrinking your circle of moral concern and having it, you're opposed to your government bombing other countries, not because you're worried about them bombing people who shouldn't be bombed, but you're worried about like the cost of the defense budget to you and your tax dollars. And you just think it's like none of our business, or like those people aren't worth American concern. And you get all these really nasty, bigoted arguments out of this stuff. And you do briefly say that we should be, in one sense, internationalist, and in another sense, isolationist in the piece. So I was just curious if you could speak to that a bit. Internationalism versus isolationism. What's the deal?
Okay. And also, I think one current conflict we haven't talked about is Russia and Ukraine, and this is something where I think that that you see, I think, problematic arguments of two kinds. So, on the one hand, there are the people who want the U.S. government to intervene on behalf of Ukraine, to get involved in the war between Russia and Ukraine. There are probably some people want the U.S. to intervene on the side of Russia, but won't talk about them. Talk about you should at least have some modicum of sanity. So there are people who think what Russia is doing to Ukraine is awful and unjust, and that seems right. And so they want government to get involved. But now I'm all for various kinds of private help and support to Ukraine, but I don't want the government to get us into a war with Russia. I think that the results of that would be very bad. On the other hand, there's some people who are against the U.S. is getting involved with Ukraine, and I agree with that position. But the reason for it is kind of the callous one you said as well. Well, it's none of our business. They're just they're not American citizens. We should defend American citizens. It's just costly, expensive to us. And I think it matters. Military intervention. One of the bad things about it is that it's tax funded, and it takes your money away and uses it for that. But when people focus on that, is that's the worst thing about it. That seems a mistake. And also to say, well, who cares? Some people who are opposed to intervening will say, who cares about the Ukrainians? Or they'll say, well, Zelensky has neo-Nazi ties. I have no idea if he does or not. I haven't really looked into it. I don't really care. I mean, if Russia is bombing all these civilians, that's not going to be justified, regardless of whether Zelensky is a good, nice guy or not. So there's a kind of callousness.
Right. These same people point out that like the U.S. bombing, the firebombing of like Dresden in World War II was like immoral, and now they're apologetic for Russia because of neo-Nazi connections to Zelensky.
Yeah, because
it seems inconsistent that we haven't touched on that in this episode yet. But seems inconsistent.
The people in Germany were not neo-Nazis.
Oh, I'm sorry. Not OG Nazis are
Yeah,
fine.
OG,
Neo
yeah,
Nazis are just too
neo-Nazis,
much,
OG
too
Nazis.
far.
Yeah, I know if they're not OG Nazis, then they're just sparkling fascists. Um, anyway, so so I don't favor military involvement with. I don't favor the U.S. getting military involved. Well, really anywhere. Um, Now, I do understand one argument people said is, well, look, we kind of encouraged Ukraine. We told them that they would, we encouraged them to declare independence from Russia in exchange for some kind of suggestion that we would help them if they did. And suppose that's true. Well, it's sort of shitty government policy, but I don't think that the U.S. government has a right to drag us into World War III because they shittily made dishonest promises to someone. But also, so I don't favor intervention, but that doesn't mean I think that we think, oh well, they don't matter because they're not American citizens. I mean, who cares about America? Well, I know who cares, but I mean, why would anyone care about American citizenship? I mean, they're just whether their name is written down in some record or not suddenly makes a difference as to whether their lives matter or not. And if there's some kind of modern equivalent of the people who went over to fight against Franco during the Spanish Civil War, so a lot of Americans signed up for that. I'm in favor of private efforts to resist Russia. Go for it.
And I think that is important because it does alter the there's gradients and degrees of badness to foreign policy, and tying back to the very initial point that we were on, which is this symmetry, this moral parallel that libertarians insist on drawing between governmental actions and private individual actions. Because if it's permissible for private individuals and organizations to, say, supply arms to resistance groups that are under attack or occupation from another government, then it seems that in principle it would be morally permissible, except for funding it through taxpayer dollars for a government to do so. And it's only because of these prudential concerns you have about drawing the U.S. government into this prolonged conflict that risks conflict with another nuclear power and a potential greater war, and all these prudential concerns. And not to say prudential concerns are totally demarcated off of concerns of justice, as we discussed earlier, but it just seems different to me than like a case where your government is like the one bombing civilians. Like that would be impermissible for private civilians to do as well, to go bomb innocents as well. So it's impermissible for both. So it seems like just a different degree, a different kind of badness or issue than that.
And also, I think that I briefly touched on this in the article. Is it's generally been regarded that a policy of assassinating foreign leaders is somehow ungentlemanly. And it seems in many cases that would be both more just and more cost effective. I mean, it's not easy, but
Right.
if during World War II someone had gone and managed to kill Hitler and several of his main cronies, that would have made a significant contribution to the war effort in prudential terms, and then in moral terms, it certainly wouldn't better than firebombing Dresden, and so now that we've got precision, I mean, I'm not not calling for this, but I mean it'd be better to take out a foreign leader with some kind of precision strike than than just to go and kill a bunch of the civilians. I mean, there's this this ideology of total war, which is regarding the entire civilian population is somehow involved in maintaining the war effort. Of course they are, but if you push that argument, then they would have just as much right to kill everyone on your side. And And
Yeah.
if you find that conclusion unpalatable, then you should. And again, regardless of who started it, even the privity thing, if if they're both doing unjust stuff, as they generally are.
Now, um, we got kind of off onto a tangent with these contemporary issues, but to return to the very end of your piece, on internationalism versus isolationism, these dueling themes. I
mhm.
mean, you say libertarians must continue to be economic and cultural internationalists, but political and military isolationists. So, can you elaborate on that?
Okay, yeah. So people sometimes treat isolationism and internationalism as, each one is sort of a full package. So that an isolationist is someone who is, doesn't get involved in foreign military ventures, but also wants to reduce economic dependence on other countries, and also sort of suspicious of cultural influences from other countries. Versus, the internationalist is someone who is open to world trade and is cosmopolitan, and is open to other cultures, but also they want to get involved in various kinds of military alliances and so forth, and promote democracy around the world or whatever. And so I'm trying to divide those and think, well, uh, the military internationalism is stuff that violates rights, whereas the economic and cultural isolationism also violates rights. Economic one definitely. Cultural tends to contribute to it in any way, so it's sort of crappy. Of course, the worst combination is if you're a military internationalist and a economic and cultural isolationist, which seems to be
Right.
what we've got running the country at the moment is the worst of both worlds. Um, but I mean, it's not consistently either of those things, because consistency is something that's beyond. Well, anyway. But yeah, so we want to, so it seems like the libertarian thing is economics and culture are matters of dealing through voluntary and mutually advantageous relationships with people, whereas bombing people is not that. And so it seems like you want to, you should expand the extent to which you are involved with people economically and culturally, and constrict the extent to which there are military things going on. And in fact, as many libertarian thinkers have pointed out, Bastiat, Mises, and so forth have pointed out, is that economic isolationism actually tends to breed military internationalism, because if you regard goods and services from other countries not as a benefit to you, but as a hazard, because you have these protectionist views, then all these other countries you regard as potential enemies, even if they're not doing anything militarily, they're just producing goods and services. And if you regard other countries producing goods and services as some kind of threat to your economic independence, that's going to push you in a military direction. And we've seen it, many, many times historically. Anyway,
Well, aren't you worried maybe about another causal relationship? And it feels like there's no shortage of left libertarians pointing out the connection between economic expansion and globalized trade, and the military and naval policies and actions necessary to like keep trade routes open in the ocean and things like that. And so aren't you worried maybe sometimes they go more together? It feels like
yeah. Well, I mean,
more
so there are
Marxists see
different
them as more going together.
kinds of economic internationalism. There's the economic internationalism where you are, sort of trying to force your way into foreign trade, basically the way that that the the way the British Empire or the Americans forced open China to trade, saying saying we have a right to trade with you, and so if we have to kill a bunch of your people to get you to trade with us, so be it. Economic internationalism can have its bad side. There's global trade that is conducted by peaceful, voluntary, mutually advantageous ways, but of course in the present world, global trade is conducted by various military and political means. Actually, same thing for isolationism. There's some societies that are economically isolationist because they're just trying to get away from the local state. I think of James C. Scott's discussion of societies trying to get away from the local state. Although, as he points out, often there were economic relations even when there weren't political ones. But still, suppose there's some local state that's trying to tax you, is trying to conscript you, like the examples he talks about in Southeast Asia. And so you just head up to the hills and you want to be left alone. Now, generally, that kind of isolationism where you don't even want to trade with other people isn't ideal. But if the people that you would be trading with are people who would also be trying to tax you and conscript you, then it becomes the economic isolationism becomes more understandable. So it's not as if all economic isolationism is bad, all economic internationalism is good. It's going to depend on the reasons for it and the means. But sort of the ideal is free and open trade with everyone, but not so much the bombing.
That sounds good. Sign me up. I think we should wrap up, but I have one final question, and that is, why do you think so many libertarians get led astray on this issue? If it's so important and it's so salient, but from, like we've discussed already, Hiroshima to Iraq to Palestine. What do you think are the common factors that keep libertarians from applying their theoretical principles in the appropriate manner in this case?
Well, I think so. One of them is, we talked about a bit, is a certain kind of collectivism of thinking of, our country is all one unit and that country over there is all one unit. And so somehow that leads you to think that retaliating against that glop of all those people over there counts as non-initiatory, and of course, and particularly the stronger case, and certainly not all libertarians who deviate on these issues are going to be like this, but there are libertarians or self-described libertarians who are like this, and that they care only about they really are committed only to their own freedom. They're anti-government because their freedom and the freedom of people they like is being constricted, and that's what they don't like. They don't really give a shit about other people. Now, not all the libertarians who are led astray are like that. I don't want to say that. There are people who are libertarians who I think are overall very decent, but they'll make a mistake because they'll identify in particular, with some particular country or movement or cause for reasons that are partly understandable, but they will, they will want to ally that with, they'll want to see that somehow any threat to the side that they like, they will want to interpret it in such a way that any response to that threat is going to count as purely defensive. Also, I think to some extent, libertarians underestimate the resources of their own theory. In the sense they think, well, look, if we can't respond in these overwhelmingly violent ways, then we're just defenseless. There's nothing we can do. And so they're exaggerating the effectiveness of government and the ineffectiveness of non-governmental means of doing
They're
things.
upset at you again. They're calling you.
Yeah, well,
they don't like your attacks. This is their retaliation.
So they're sending sound waves into my apartment. So where's my bazooka? But yeah. This is actually, I touched very briefly on this in the article, that that by relying solely on governmental responses, we're ignoring the fact that there are non-governmental ways of addressing these problems that have been sort of crowded out by focusing everything on the governmental means. And libertarians should be, more optimistic about non-governmental means and less optimistic about governmental ones, because that's what we're all about.
That's a good and underrated point in this context. Maybe a good, slightly more hopeful note to end on. Well, this has been a great discussion. This might be our longest episode yet, but the topic certainly warranted it. The piece is great. The piece itself isn't even that long, I would say, but a lot of
we just read it aloud without taking that long to read.
Yeah,
of course, we did a lot of digressions.
That's true, a fair amount of those. But hopefully, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the discussion. I hope our listeners and viewers enjoyed it as well. Thanks for listening, and check out the article as well. Of course, it'll be linked below along with the other pieces that we mentioned. Please contact us. You can tweet at me or message us on Facebook or email C4SS if you have suggestions for the show, pieces you want us to cover, requests for articles you want us to cover, anything like that. We're always looking to get a pulse on what our viewers and listeners are interested in. So with that, obviously look out for our next episode, episode 6. Please, of course, follow C4SS on social media, on Bluesky. Check us out on Patreon, where we post everything. And
is it
thanks for watching.
Blue Sky.
Oh yeah, I just pronounce it Bluesky because I read it so much before ever hearing it pronounced, and I don't know.
Yeah.
That's how I read it in my head.
This is the first time I've ever heard it pronounced, so you could convince me either way how it is.
No, it is Blue Sky. You should get on there, Roderick, because you probably have a lot of free time and nothing to do. But well, on that note, that's a good one. Thanks for listening and watching, everyone. Thanks, Roderick, for lending us your time and discussing your article. And see you all next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.